Hello and welcome to Classical Theology. Glad you guys are here. This is our third live stream on this channel. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Glad y'all are here. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. We're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and the reason why I made the channel is because I like this stuff so much, and I like teaching about it. I like talking about it, researching it, and that's the subject of natural theology. So, what is natural theology? I've had people question that recently on social media when I said I was doing this live stream. So I'm glad to hear that because the people who don't know, so we're going to hopefully be able to learn some new stuff tonight. Hopefully that's fun for you. I'm going to show you some of my favorite books on the topic, and we're going to just jump on in. So, what is natural theology? Natural theology is just quickly put, and as straightforward as possibly can say it, is what we can know about God through nature. That's why it's natural, through nature and creation. So, what we can know about God through nature and creation. So, what can we know about God through nature and creation? And this is very debated and controversial among Christians. So, if you're watching, whether you're watching the live stream or the recording, let me know, what do you think about natural theology? Do you think we can do this? Do you think we can prove God exists through reason? And how far can reason take us and what we can know about God? So we're going to look at those questions tonight. So, but natural theology, also called general revelation in terms of what we can know about God, is through what we can know about God through nature and creation and what has been made. There's some pushback on this from people, and so I'm going to read three passages where I think the Bible supports this. So just bear with me. Um, Romans 1, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. And then I'm going to skip to verse 20. For his invisible attributes. I'm about 19. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So Paul tells us that we can know certain things about God through what has been made. And so I think Paul here is doing natural theology. I know he doesn't call it that. I think that's just what it is. He's saying we can know certain things about God through creation and through the world. In Acts, you read, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And then in the Psalms, of course, we read, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. So natural theology then is what everyone can know about God through nature, what has been made, as opposed to what we see in just in the Bible. Of course, we know God through the Bible as well and what he's like. But what we can know about God apart from the Bible in just reason alone, just through nature alone, this is what we're going to look at tonight, natural theology, and how far we can take it, how far our reason will let us go with our natural theology. So how far do you think it can go? Give me a comment. And if you have questions, if you're here watching the live stream, if you can write the word question before you ask a question, I'm going to try to watch the comments. And sometimes there's some conversations in the comments, which is great. But I try to figure out what's straight to me. So if you can write the word question, that'd be great. But how far do you think reason can take us with natural theology, or can it go anywhere at all? So what the Bible tells us that natural revelation cannot, there are some limits on natural revelation, natural theology, and that is things that we would have to have revealed to us from God. And most people, most philosophers think that would be stuff like the Trinity, the incarnation, the atonement, anything that's directly revealed to God, from God to us through the Bible, that we wouldn't get through nature alone. Okay. So natural theology can tell us about God's existence as well as his nature. And we're going to look and see what we think about God's nature from natural theology. Well, first we're going to look at God's existence and look at some theistic proofs. Now, there are basically two ways of going about looking at these proofs in terms of what direction they come from. So one of my good friends, Chaplain Thomas Bayes, says, Dr. Elfling, good to be here, good to be with you. I do think Romans 1 establishes a role for natural theology. Thank you. Yep, I agree very much. Thank you for the comment. Appreciate it. So we have two kinds of arguments that we have regarding God's existence. Two categories. If you take any argument for God's existence, whether it's the Kalam argument, the five ways, the ontological, they're going to either be a posteriori or a priori. And all that means is if it's a posteriori, you see the word post in there. And all that means is that we have knowledge of something post or after experience. Or a proof is a proof in this case would be relying on our experience to show God exists or to show anything, any argument or any knowledge is a posteriori if it's known through experience. Or an argument can be, or any kind of knowledge can be known a priori, so prior, known prior to or without experience. Okay, so we're going to look at some of these proofs. One that's been making the rounds recently on social media is the ontological argument, made famous by Anselm and then reworked by Alvin Plantinga here recently in the 20th century, 21st century. And the old argument goes like this: God is a being that which nothing greater can be conceived. You can't think of anything greater than God. Okay? It's better to exist extramentally than just mentally. Okay, so if you can think of something in your mind, that's great, but it's better for it to exist out in the real world and in reality in some way than just in the mind. And therefore, he thinks God must exist because, in reality, in extramental reality, because if he only existed in the mind, then we could conceive of something greater in the actual world. And according to his definition of God, God is a being that which none greater can be conceived. But if he only existed in the mind, you could conceive something greater in reality. So what causes this logical contradiction? This has been one of the most controversial theistic proofs ever in the history of the church, even among theists and among Christians as well. And there have been Christians on both sides. So what do you guys think of this? Jorge, I don't think so. Jorge says presuppositionalism is the gospel. All right. Jorge's a good friend of mine. Thanks for being here, buddy. Appreciate it. You guys agree with the ontological argument? What do you think about the argument? There are lots of people. Immediately, it was debated among people in the church, like Gonillo, who tried to make a counterexample through the island, the famous island counterexample. Like Thomas Aquinas rejected it. Kant rejected it. There's been some rounds, though, on social media going around about this argument. And some people are now saying that they think there's more to it than they thought before. And of course, Plantinga has made it, again, more well known and kind of refreshed it from a modal ontological kind of way. We're not going to go that way tonight. Geyser and Cordwin say in their book, Philosophy of Religion, it is logically necessary. It's kind of figuring out what Anselm's saying here in a kind of straightforward way. It's logically necessary to affirm of a necessary existent what is logically necessary to the concept of such a being. Real existence is logically necessary to the concept of a necessary existence. Hence, it is logically necessary to affirm that a necessary existent really exists. This is somewhat of Anselm's comeback to Gonillo, when Gonillo was trying to show that, well, if you take an island, you can't apply this to an island, therefore we can't apply it to God. And Anselm was saying, well, we're not talking about an island, we're talking about things that are necessary and how they exist. Now, there are lots of arguments for God's existence. What do you guys think is the best one? You got the Kalam argument, which is famous from Bill Craig today, which goes back to the Islamic roots. Basically, the argument says everything has a beginning, has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. The moral argument, because we have morality, we're going to have to look back to some kind of an ultimate grounding toward morality. The teleological argument, that there's so much design in the things that we see. Famous watch example from Paley. Argument from evil. Well, a lot of atheists want to say that evil shows God doesn't exist, but sometimes theists will flip that and say it's because we have some kind of standard in some way or another to be able to say what evil is compared to good, that there's got to be some kind of object of good to make evil itself objective. So we have an argument from good, argument from evil, an argument from consciousness. So if you want to look at more arguments, these kinds of arguments, I would recommend this book to you. It's the Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology. A lot of great authors in this book. I'm going to show you one of my favorites as well here in a little bit. But those are some of the arguments that tell us about God's existence. And we're going to focus on one that's a little bit different, going back further into the medieval ages. That is Aquinas is one of Aquinas' five ways. Probably, if you're familiar with anything regarding God's existence and arguments, you're probably familiar with the five ways of Thomas Aquinas. And we're going to see what Aquinas thinks about natural theology, where we get, how far we get with, say, the study of God via his we're going to look primarily at his first way. Here they are, though. We're going to look at the argument for motion. We're going to look at the whole thing and read the whole thing. But there are also arguments from efficient causality, contingency, necessity, gradation, from perfection of being, and teleology, which is the goal-directedness of being. It's not exactly the kind of ID arguments we see today with, say, Bill Dembski and Stephen Meyer and those kind of folks. This is like an arrow being shot at a target needs something that will direct it. Now, bear with me. All these arguments are going to be moving from the effect to the cause, so from things that exist in the physical, real world. But these arguments are limited. We're going to have an imperfect knowledge about God. We're not going to have we're going to have a full blown view of God because of this, because we're finite. But we're going to look at this one way. It's a little bit long. Bear with me. I think we're going to get a lot of mileage from this argument if it's sound. What does sound mean? Sound means that if the argument is valid, everything in it is true, then it's said to be sound. If this way is valid, I think it'll clinch what we call classical theology, which is what this channel is all about. So let me know what you think about this argument. I'm going to read the whole thing. I'm going to kind of distill it down into a kind of a straightforward way of looking at it. The first and more manifest way, the most obvious way Aquinas says we can know about God, is the argument from motion. Now, he does not mean inertia. He doesn't mean if I take this book and chuck it across the room, it's going to be an inertia. That's not what he means. That's kind of motion. He means change. So motion for Aquinas is going back to Aristotle's view of motion, which is a thing moving from potentiality to actuality. And to give you an example, so I'm actually sitting, but I'm potentially standing or lying down or whatever. And then when I actualize that, then I'm no longer potentially doing it, I'm actually doing it. Okay. So this notion of motion is having to do with change. So it is certainly says and evident to our senses that in the world, some things are in motion or some things are changing. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, for nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that toward which it is in motion, whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is an act, for motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality, or nothing can be changed except by something in a state of actuality. Thus, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it's not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. So I can't actually be sitting and potentially be sitting. It's got to be one or the other. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. So it's actually hot, but it could be cold. It's therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved. That is, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. And if that by which is put in motion by itself be put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. That's a lot. That's a long quote. Thanks for bearing with me. But if this is sound, we get a lot out of this. In fact, I would contend we get a lot more out of this than the other arguments we put up a few minutes ago, like the kalam, the moral, the teleological. If this is sound, okay, so you guys think this is sound? What do you think about this argument? You think this is sound? This is a good argument? Not a good argument? All right. So what's the point here? What's the point of the first way? Well, what's trying to show that there is an unmoved mover, there is some beings, back to Aristotle, who thought there was an unmoved mover for every celestial sphere, That means it's not moved or changed or affected by anything else. This is a being of pure act. Why is it pure act? Because if it has no potentiality, then what is it? It's got to be pure act, or another word for act would be existence. So it's got to be being of pure act, pure existence. And this has no passive potency. In other words, it cannot be changed or affected by anything else. So for anything to be changed, it has to have some kind of potential. So if it's going to be changed passively, then it would have to be changed by something else. If I take this book and I just throw it across the room, it's being changed by me. It's receiving change by me. So it has passive potentiality. But if I do it, if I take the book and just chuck it over there, I'm causing the change. So I have active potentiality on this book. So what we're denying here from this argument is that God has no passive potentiality. Not that he has no active, because he would have to be able to create. Okay? What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Have any questions, comments, jokes, whatever? Leave me a comment. From this, again, if that is sound, then we get a lot of divine attributes from this, but starting with divine simplicity. So Aquinas starts with God's existence, and then the very first attribute, he calls them names, we get divine simplicity. What does that mean? Well, it means God doesn't have any kind of parts. He is not put together. There's no distinctions. There's no composition. So he doesn't have a body and a soul. He doesn't have form and matter. There's no immaterial part and material part. He doesn't have this act and potency like we do. He doesn't even have a difference between his essence, his nature, and his existence. For Aquinas, and in this way of thinking, God and only God has the nature to exist. So we don't. We don't have to exist. We didn't have to be brought into existence, and we could go out of existence. There's nothing in God that we have that would be substance and accident. So as a substance, we're people. We're an individual human being, and we have accidents or characteristics. So you have a certain skin color, hair color, eye color, height, weight, and all that. Those are characteristics or actions. God doesn't have anything like that at all. God is not composed of one thing plus something else. God is one complete, undifferentiated, infinite unity of being. This is what divine simplicity means. He doesn't have even genus and difference. There's no distinctions in God whatsoever. There's no modification in God. There's nothing that separates or makes God different than another quote unquote aspect of God. Whatever God is, he has, and there's nothing that has any kind of distinctions in him. Here's just a smattering of some of the defenders of this view. This was almost universally held in the early church, ancient church, medieval church, even the modern church. It was very widely held. It's being questioned nowadays by various people. But here's some people. I'm going to read this to you. You can see them. But well, if you happen to watch this later in the audio only, I'll say some names. These have Irenaeus, Augustine, Anselm Aquinas, Scotus, Occam, Calvin, Arminius, and then more recently have Charnock, Turton, Shedd, Geisler, Sproul, Dolezal, Davies, and Fazer. So a lot of folks have held to this. And so I think this should give us pause when we have people telling us that this is a complete irrational doctrine. We got people who are Reformed, not Reformed, Catholic, and Protestant throughout all church history holding to this doctrine. Should at least give us pause and think, well, if pretty much everybody throughout the church history held to this doctrine, maybe it's not quite as irrational or ridiculous as some people today want us to believe. So I've had some other videos on this. I'm not going to go into much more detail here. But if you want to learn more about simplicity, I have other videos on my channel. We'll go over it more as well throughout the channel as we go forward. Now, if we have God being pure act, and if simplicity follows, then there are other doctrines that follow from that, other characteristics, or as Aquinas calls them, names or attributes that we would have from him. From simplicity. Okay. All glory to the Lord God Almighty and Jesus Christ. Amen. So what follows? If simplicity is true, we get a few other doctrines. Now I've got a challenge here. It says Romans 1 teaches direct knowledge of the Christian God, not some first mover. Okay. Thanks for the comment. Let me ask you a question. So Romans 1 says that we know God through creation, through what has been made. So in what way do you think it's direct? Because if it's direct, or if you heard the debate between Sproul and Bonson back in I think it was the 80s, I'm not sure, 80s, 90s. No, Bonson was saying we have immediate knowledge of God. That is unmediated knowledge. And that really threw Sproul. Sproul had to ask what he meant by that and what he said, actually. So do you think that, uh, how could it be direct knowledge if it's through what has been made? Okay. So right here it says, how do you explain the Trinity in simplicity? Great question. And this is admittedly difficult. Um, well, the Trinity is only a problem if you hold that they are somehow differentiations or parts of God. But actually, in Matthew Barrett's book, I forgot the exact title, but it's about simplicity in the Trinity, argue that for the Trinity to be true, simplicity must be true, that there can't be parts. Otherwise, we have some kind of more like tritheism or different aspects of God. And if God is divided in some way, it's hard to see how he's infinite, because you can't have something that's quantitatively infinite in that regard. Okay. Great questions. Appreciate it. Thank you. But it is admittedly difficult. Aquinas' answer is that these are some kinds of opposing relations. They're not parts, though. And so what Aquinas is denying here is that they are any kind of parts, that they are modifications or separate, that the persons really are even separate from the divine nature. Okay. So how do we get immutability, eternality, and impassibility? First of all, what are these things, and how do we derive that from God being pure act and being simple? Okay. So immutability just means that God is unchanging. He's not like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that change, and they got in the goo and they changed. He's immutable. Okay. So being immutable means that he's not changed by anything. He has no passive potentiality. He is a perfect being, and a perfect being can't change. It would have to become more or less perfect in order to change. Now, some people have recently challenged this. I think when Ryan Mullins challenged this in one of his books, that it doesn't require going from less perfect to more perfect, or more perfect to less perfect. I think it was him with me and somebody else. I think it was him. This has been an argument for a long time regarding the nature of perfection. Is if you're perfect and you change, are you moving away from perfection or toward perfection? I think it's an interesting question, a valid question to ask. And also, an infinite being can't change, as it would gain something it didn't have before, or lose something in some way. The argument from perfection here is that if God really is perfect and infinite, then he can't gain something that he didn't have before. But ultimately, if God is pure act, he wouldn't have any kind of passive potentiality. He would be pure act, therefore he wouldn't have the ability to change. So it's not just that the scriptures say that he will not change. If this is true, he cannot change. Radically different. All right, I have a response to my question here. Let's see. Things in creation non-inferentially cause an individual to know God, but notice that this doesn't argue for some class of timeless, non-spatial cause of the universe. Well, Paul does say that he has a divine nature and eternal power. So he used, and another word for eternal, whether in Hebrew or Greek, mean timelessness. This is why I'm saying that we have a natural theology. But I think Paul's saying that we can know things through nature, though. Would you not agree with that? That we have certain things that we can know about God, his divine nature and eternal power. Um, and if you look through, and this is interesting that you say material. You said, notice that this doesn't argue for some class of timeless, non-spatial cause. Okay. So yeah, the Bible does tend to argue that, well, I'm sorry, not argue, but the Bible does tend to portray God as a physical being more often than it portrays him as a spiritual being. Now, John 4:24 does say that God is spirit, but how would you take that as being literal, and not the passages that say God smells the sacrifices, or hears this, or sees that, or whatever? All right. Question here is, are you arguing for absolute divine simplicity, or just a view in which distinct attributes can exist, but don't imply complexity? I'm arguing, and I'm saying that Aquinas is arguing for absolute divine simplicity. God's identical to all his attributes, but his attributes are distinct. Okay. That's kind of a James White view recently, where we have God is identical to his attributes, but if they're distinct, then there's something literally distinct in God's nature. So people who hold that view I mean, you may want to hold that view, that's fine, but that's not the traditional view of divine simplicity. And of course, it has evolved over the years, as every doctrine has, from Irenaeus to Aquinas and even beyond. So, but if you want to maintain that God has distinct attributes and he's identical to them, then there are going to be some kind of distinctions in God via his attributes. All right. So, immutability follows this pure act and simplicity if that's sound. And then eternality, kind of get at your comment here. Um, the classical notion here of time is a unit or measurement of change going back to at least Aristotle. Okay. So, for change to happen, for me to talk to you or to throw them, my famous book now, to throw it across the room would take a before and an after. Before I threw it and an after I threw it. Well, that requires time. Well, if there's nothing changing, then there's nothing being measured by time. So he would argue that seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years don't really exist per se in themselves. It's just a way of measuring how much change has happened to a thing. So we say that the Earth has rotated on its axis after 24 hours because that's how much change has happened in that quote unquote time. Now, so no change equals no time. And then if God doesn't have change, if he's pure act, if he's simple, if he's immutable, then he's not changing. And so he's not being measured by time. Okay, so this means that God would not be temporal in the sense of having a before and an after. This is the classical definition of God going back to Boethius and saying that eternity is the simultaneous possession of illimitable life. All that means is that whereas we lose time, I go back and I have kids and years gonna go down the road. I'm gonna miss him being 5, I miss him being 10. Um, or I miss being 5 myself, or miss being 15 or whatever myself. Well, that's gone. That part of my life is just gone. God doesn't lose any part of his life. That's what Boethius here is trying to say. All right. Yeah, Scotus held, so the comment here is that Scotus held something like that. Scotus held that there was a formal distinction between attributes, not an actual or literal one or a real one, but one in form. And he tried because he wanted to maintain simplicity. So he wanted to maintain this, what he called a formal distinction. And what functioned for simplicity for Aquinas, Scotus used infinity. So Scotus used the notion of infinity to kind of blend the attributes of God together, because if they're all infinite, then they don't really have anywhere where they quote unquote stop or start. So yeah, Scotus held to this kind of formal distinction, and not a real distinction, but more of a formal based on the name or the kind of attribute that it is. That justice is different than power and different than knowledge and all that kind of stuff, right? All right. Um, I was going to call you Chapman base. Um, Tom says, I do think that this level of philosophy regarding God has a weakness in that it attempts to understand God within a framework. Yes, we understand. Yes, yes, it does. That's why I say it is a Thomistic framework following on Aristotle as well. And then he follows it by saying, yeah, we think we must allow for God to exist both within and beyond our understanding. Of course, yes, I would agree with that. So would Aquinas. Natural theology says, therefore, can be real, helpful, and inadequate. Right. Yes. So Aquinas would say this. I would say this, that while we can know certain things about God, as I said before in the previous slide, it's going to be finite. It's going to be um, incomplete. And we're never going to fully understand God, even after an eternity of time to be able to do it. All right. So if pure actuality is true, if the first way of Aquinas is true and sound, we get a lot out of that. Okay, we get that God is pure act, simple, no potentiality, so it can't be changing, not measured by time, and he's impassible. And this is the one that is really gets people mad. This one, and I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation on this one. Impassibility means that nothing affects God. Well, it means that if God can't change and he's not in time, then he's impassible. Meaning that the notion of God here is one that where he cannot be affected or suffer passions. So that means that nothing that we do changes him or affects him. But you say, well, what about the passages that say God gets jealous or God gets angry or God gets grieved? I would say that we say the same thing about those passages that we do about God having a nose and eyes and ears, is that there's a literal truth behind a figure of speech, behind a metaphor or some kind of figure of speech. That we say that God got angry because he brought about effects and acted like in our from our point of view like an angry person would, or like a jealous person would, or whatever. So this doctrine, though, again, widely held throughout the church, not not overly rejected or pushed back on. I mean, it's not like it is today throughout the whole church. But this is a difficult one because that means raises the question: what about, do I not, make God mad when I sin? Do I not make Him happy when I praise Him? According to this doctrine, no. You don't make God happy. You don't make God sad. God is in complete, perfect, infinite bliss, completely apart from us. Doesn't need us for anything. And this is if this model, even before Aquinas, I mean, if people held to simplicity, immutability, eternality, and impassibility, the cornerstones of classical theism before Aquinas. This is not simply Aquinas' program. It goes back to the early church, Irenaeus and Augustine and others. So while Aquinas is well known for this, he's not the first person to bring this about. And even if Aquinas's um, particular ways will be um, maybe challenged. Again, this is not rise or fall completely on Aquinas. I think he's correct for the most part, at least on most of this. On everything we're discussing, of course, I'm not Catholic, so I don't go the whole way. In fact, my last video was on can Protestants be Thomistic thinkers, and I'd say yes to an extent. Other attributes we get from all this: aseity, from the Greek, from the Latin rather, ase. Um, I'm sure I read it in Greek recently too. So looking back to Greek as well, meaning that God is independent. He doesn't need anything. He's self sufficient. He's immaterial. Um, he's infinite. There's no boundaries. There's nothing, and he's omniscient. And notice that these are primarily negative. So simple means he doesn't have parts. Immaterial, he doesn't have matter. Immutability, he's not. He doesn't change. Eternal, he's not temporal. Impassible, he's not affected. Infinite, he's not finite. Well, there's a lot of negative theology. This is called apophatic theology. Okay, this means that we're chiseling off what God isn't, because as we're saying, and as Thomas was saying, we really can't know God directly. We can't know God in His fullness, even when we do quote unquote know Him directly in the beatific vision and heaven directly with Him. We'll never understand because we're finite. So these particular doctrines, these attributes, characteristics of God, largely, not completely, but largely are negative in that they're saying what God isn't. He's not this, He's not that. Well, what is He? We can make some positive predications. He exists, He's good, He's being, He's truth, He's all these things. But it's hard for us to really grasp and understand what that ultimately means. So a lot of philosophers and theologians practice this negative theology, via negativa, or what's called apophatic theology. Yeah. All right. Now, I get a lot of pushback when I discuss this, whether they're at conferences or on social media or on my YouTube channel, wherever. There's always objections regarding, but Jesus. Okay, but Jesus changed. But Jesus was in a body. He was in time. Yes, I'm not talking about the human nature of Jesus when I'm talking about this natural theology. I'm talking about the divine essence. I'm only talking about that. What I'm saying about God being simple, eternal, immutable, impassible, all that, even omniscient, omnipresent, that that categorization and taxonomy of attributes only applies to the divine nature, not the human nature of Jesus. Because in his human nature, he's not divine. He is limited. He's finite. He is circumscribed to a specific place and time. He changed. He was grieved. He had these literal passions. So again, I'm not talking about the humanity here of Jesus, only the divinity of God. Okay. Now, natural theology can also help us understand biblical concepts or biblical questions that people might bring up. So, for example, did Jesus have to die to forgive sin? Well, in Hebrews, we're told that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission for sins. All right. Of course, that's true. But is God following some kind of divine handbook where he has to say, okay, what do I got to do here? Okay, I got to shed blood to forgive sins. No, there's nothing that God has to do. So, yes, it was necessary for God to shed blood for the forgiveness of sins. But why? Not because there's anything in the effect of shedding blood, because there was no effect of shedding blood until God made it that way. Natural theology can help us understand the nature of necessity, to quote um, Planning's book, regarding God's nature. So there are different kinds of necessity here. There is, for example, absolute necessity, which could never be otherwise, like God's nature. This would be more like God's nature, certain things that are just true by definition. And then suppositional necessity or conditional necessity that says, well, God didn't have to send Jesus to forgive us of our sins. He didn't have to die for our sins and shed blood, but that's the way God willed it. God didn't have to create humans, but he did. So seeing that he did, it was necessary because God is an eternal, unchanging being. So he willed it from an eternal, unchanging point of view. And this is the kind of questions that natural theology can help us answer. We get questions whether you're a pastor, Sunday school teacher, a parent, whatever, and someone asks you, "Well, did Jesus have to die?" Hebrew says yes. Well, what's meant by have to? It's he had to because he made it that way. He didn't have to make it that way. So we can see these kind of distinctions that we can pull from philosophy as was once considered the handmaiden of theology to help our theological questions and see what is it that we can know about God in this way. So one major aspect of the way we talk about God and think about him and how if we make these kinds of debates or whatever, talk about God having attributes is our language. And so this really can't be overemphasized. And that is, how does our language relate to God? Well, our language can relate to God like anything else in three ways: in a univocal way, in an equivocal way, or an analogical way. And even with these ways, they can be somewhat parsed out some, especially with the analogical way. So, for example, if I say that I am good, or my microphone is good, this book is good, and my glasses are good, these are things I have either on me or just within arm's reach. Okay. But what makes this book good? Or what makes this microphone good? Or what makes my pizza good that I have sometimes to eat? Or what makes my glasses good? It's not the same thing, is it? To be a good pair of glasses means that they help me see better. All right. Or shoes are good if they're protective, comfortable, and all that, and they do what they're supposed to do. A car is good if it functions the way it's supposed to. So when I ask the question, does the word good mean the same thing as applied to God and man? What do you guys think? We're going to talk about God being and good here. These words, good, or God has knowledge, man has knowledge. God has, um, God is just, man is just. Are these going to be used the same way, univocally, or equivocally, meaning they have very different meanings? All right, like if I'm going to go to the bank and get some money versus going to the bank to go fishing, the word bank there has two different meanings. So univocal means they have the exact same meaning. Equivocal mean they have different meanings. And analogical mean they have kind of the same meaning but not completely. Right. So if I say that this book is good and this desk is good that I have right here, I think the word good there is going to be used analogically, because to be good in relation to a book is different than what it means to be good in relation to a desk or a pair of shoes or a chess move or a microphone or fill in the blank. Okay. So even in things I have on my desk here in my room, I think that we have to apply these words analogically, meaning that they're not exactly the same. Well, how much more are we going to not really be able to understand the nature, for example, of our own soul? I mean, our own cells, regarding our soul. We don't really understand our soul completely because it's immaterial. We don't really. It's hard to study it indirectly. How much more do we not get an angel? And if you think about what an angel is, what's the nature of an angel? Well, it's immaterial. But how much do we know about angels or demons? Not a lot, really. Again, know some things negatively. They're not humans. They're not infinite. They're not omnipresent. They're not physical. But what are they? It's hard to get at their nature because we don't really sense them. Whether I can sense my desk here or sense my computers or whatever. Well, if I don't get my soul and I don't understand angels that are a step closer to God from my soul, in a sense, because they're complete beings in terms of being immaterial. We're not complete. We're composed of physical and immaterial aspects. How much more are we not going to understand God? God is an infinite being. And I said this last time, I think it was my last live stream, or maybe it was the video I did last time. When I just sit around and think about God, and when I take classes on God, when I used to take classes on God, and when I read about God or teach about God now, thinking about what He is and what He's not, to me has become an act of worship because we're pondering the divine essence about what He is and saying, well, He's not this, He's not that. It just blows my mind. We have a class at SDS. It's our Systematic Theology Volume 2, and it has the history of that class. My wife and I took it together back in 2005, I think, and it was Norm Geisner Systematic Theology, and it was the kind of class that just blows your mind. Well, when you have a class that just kind of blows up, you think God's in this box, and then you blow the box up, it completely lets you understand how quote unquote big God is. Well, once your view of God becomes closer to the truth, and you think about Him and you love Him and you worship Him in that way, to me that's just worship, thinking about God in that regard. You guys agree with that? What do you guys think about that? Um, so our language about God is uh, we have to be very very careful about what we mean. Even when we talk about being analogical, people mean different things with the term of being analogical. There are different ways of being analogous. I'm not going to go too much in that detail. In that direction. Of course, there are objections to natural theology. Karl Barth is famous for bringing natural objections to natural theology because of sin and various things. Open theology. Um, Jorge jokes about presuppositionalism a little bit ago. There are objections there because they think that we're in sin, and that trying to use what they would call autonomous human reason is sinful. So they think we cannot do natural theology. We can't arise. Our knowledge can't arise from nature, from the created order, apart from God's grace. But I'm going to argue that even our own existing every day, every moment is in God's grace. So I don't think it is autonomous. I think that God keeps us alive. God keeps us in existence, and God is helping us to understand Him through His creation. It's not really completely autonomous. Um, and of course, there are different takes on this, different takes on what natural theology looks like. At process theology, where God is in a literal process of changing what has been called now theistic personalism, which is that God is seen very much more as a quote unquote regular, well, regular is a little bit uncharitable, very close to being the kind of people that we are, person that we are. He's described as a person. This would be Swinburne, Bill Craig, Plantinga, and the label theistic personalism has been kind of coined by Brian Davies back in his intro to philosophy of religion. So, questions, what guys do you have? You have any objections? I welcome objections. If you don't agree, that's fine. A lot of other areas that we could talk about. I told you I'd tell you my favorite book. This is my favorite book on natural theology. It's called An Introduction to Natural Theology by Maurice Holloway. I'll leave a link to this as well as the Blackwell Companion in the description. But this is my favorite book. It just gets right to the point. It is Thomistic. It is based on Aristotelian Thomistic kind of thinking. That it goes over the nature of natural theology. Can we know God exists? Can it be demonstrated? The nature of demonstration, the 5 ways, how we know about God. How does God know things? So, how does God have knowledge of the world? There was somebody, a philosopher back in 2019, who said, "Well, God can't be all knowing and all good because if He's all knowing, He knows what it's like to lust. But if He knows what it's like to lust, He can't be all good. So it's got to be one or the other." What do you guys think of that? How would you respond to that? That God, uh, if He knows what it's like to lust, He is not all good. If He doesn't know what it's like to lust, He can't be all knowing. How would you respond to that? Where He says, "I'm certain there are faults in my thinking, but when I try explaining God being good, I give this example. Iced tea becomes sweet when you add sugar, whereas sugar is sweet by its own nature." That's good. I like that. Yeah. Yeah, you don't. So this is why I'm saying He's simple. There's nothing. There's no goodness added to God. There's no justice. Whatever you want to fill in the blank with. There's no knowledge. Nothing added to God. Um, And ultimately, in that view of simplicity, the actual attributes are identical to him, and in him, they're identical to each other, and we just pick them out with different definitions because of how we know things from composite complex reality. That's right. I like that. Good point. I think I've heard that before. That's good. Um, I would object that who's he? I would object that he's assuming univocal view of divine. Oh, yeah, the philosopher, of course. Thanks. Yes, not just univocal. It is univocal in the sense that he knows things the way that we do. Is that what you mean? That he knows things the way that we do? It's also he um, seems to think that if God knows something, it's like us. Like that's might be where you're going with that, and that's through experience. So when a person knows lust, it's usually from experiencing it. I mean, I guess you got somebody who doesn't have. There are people who don't experience emotions the same way as other people. So you might be able to watch it, and someone might be able to describe it. But yeah, I think you're right that this view of his name is Peter Adderton. He was from California and wrote an op-ed in the New York Times back in 2019. And yeah, I think he's assuming that God's knowledge is univocal, very much like ours. That's like the theistic personalist, I would argue, and experiential. All right. Old things pass away, all become new. Says, I had a long chat with someone on X about God and time. He mentioned that he believes in open theism because the future isn't real or actual. I didn't know how to respond. Okay, that's a good question. Um, so open theism, if you don't know what that is the idea that, as you just said, the future is open because it hasn't happened yet. That it hasn't happened, it doesn't exist yet, it hasn't happened yet. And this makes several assumptions. And open theists hate natural theology for several reasons. One, because they think that we're being way too um, we're not being literal enough with the Bible. Okay, that when the Bible says that God was angry, jealous, grieved, he literally was. They also hate these categories that we're looking at. They hate the Greek origin of things like God being simple, eternal, and whatever. And they say that these are Greek and pagan ways of thinking. Therefore, we shouldn't have that view. The problem with that is that it's a genetic fallacy. Someone's not right or wrong because of where it comes from. Also, the Greeks held to every kind of possible way you could think about God or the gods, plural. They were physical. They didn't know the future all the time. They became emotional. They were physical in a lot of cases, so they would eat and have sex and go from place to another. And so that's why that argument doesn't work. Um, but the future doesn't exist per se in the way the present does. But the question is it future to God? It's only future to God if you take God to be in time. If you take God to be eternal, that is outside of time, then there is no past, present, and future for God. But even if there is a future for God and time hasn't happened yet, you still can make the argument that God is completely sovereign over it and willing what's going to happen. So I don't think that does that help your if you're asking the question, did that help maybe give you some way to respond to that? Um, Norm Geisler's book, um, the battle that's not his. The battle for God is good, and also making God in the image of man discusses this is he calls it neoclassical or neotheism rather. Does that help? Though? I hope that makes some sense to you. What makes it truly predicate a property of God? It seems to me that there's no grounding, so Thomas can only say there's divinely caused illusions. What makes it truly predicate a property of God? There's no. I'm not sure what you're saying. Can you maybe say it in a different way? So Thomas would deny that God has properties, because properties would be akin to say accidents for Aristotle. So for Thomas says that we name God. These different attributes are called names. So simplicity, omnipresence, love, justice. Those are names that we describe God as having. And in most cases, or a lot of cases, they're more perfect in Him than they are in us. I'm not really sure what you mean by there's no way to ground it. Feel free to come back and explain that if you want to. No grounding, so Thomas can only say there is divinely caused illusions. So Thomas don't say that we're only experiencing illusions, but I'm not following your grounding problem. Not to get kind of moralistic on you, but what do you mean there? And then Ray comes back and says, "In my view, knowing how lust feels does not necessarily equate to sin. If God does not know what sex drive is, how could he have created sex? Right. So, in fact, my pastor mentioned this in our church this past weekend. So, to be tempted uh, itself isn't a sin, but it seemed like lust would be, because if you're tempted to lust, it wouldn't be a sin. But if you're actually lusting, then that would, I would think, be a sin. Maybe you would disagree. I don't know if you agree with that or not. But to me, I think if you're actually lusting, you're ongoing in lust. That would be a sin. Um, yeah, he knows what lust is, but not through experience. So God would know that we lust because He understands our nature, and this also kind of assumes a very deistic view of God, that God is kind of sitting back, kind of watching what's happening. Whereas more in the Thomistic view, God isn't kind of just sitting back watching. He is, again, actively upholding and causing all of us moment by moment, so that He knows what we are and what we're doing, not because He's kind of passively taking in sensations like we do with our sight and hearing and everything, but because He's actively causing us every moment. Um, all right. So you said, yeah, but he said if the future is actual, that we exist in the future already, as if it has already happened. Um, well, I don't disagree that the future hasn't happened yet. I wouldn't disagree with this open theist there on that point. I don't. I'm a presentist, meaning that in my view, the only time, quote unquote, that exists is the present. The past is gone. The future has not happened yet. Okay. Different theories, and that's a whole different theory of philosophy of time. Feel free to ask a question. I'm happy to um, go into more detail about that. But you don't have to assume, even if you assume that the future isn't quote unquote in existence, um, that doesn't mean that God isn't sovereign. But I don't think it would be future for God unless He was temporal. If God is temporal, then there wouldn't be a future for God. It would be a future for us, but not for God. And if God is causing all things to happen, then He wouldn't be in the dark, as it were. As the open theists say, He's kind of learning as He goes. Uh, and I think this open theist view is very problematic because it makes God way too much like us. And you get down the road like Clark Pinnock and you start thinking the God actually is physical. It's a very Mormon view of God once you start going down that road. Tom says that argument is a good example of a person trying to limit God to a framework of his understanding. Yeah, exactly. Very good. Thinking of the comment here. Usually Thomas say there are illusions because something about God makes the distinct ideas we have about Him true in some way. But what's that? Thomas say there are illusions because something about God makes the distinct ideas we have about Him true in some way. But what is that? I'm not sure what you're saying here. Our ideas are true about God if they in some way really reflect Him or correspond to Him, and it's in a very correspondence view of reality. Again, Thomism is not monolithic where everyone believes the same thing. It's kind of a general framework of understanding that. Um, I've never heard of Thomas. I've been a Thomas for 20 years and been studying him for 20 years or years. I've never quite heard that before. I don't think we have a grounding problem in this regard. Um, and I'm still not quite tracking with you. I'm sorry. I'm trying to follow your thought here. I'm not quite getting it. There are illusions. What's illusions? What are you saying are illusions? Bible enjoyer. Hey, how you doing? Glad to have you here. Um, are you a determinist? I'm a compatibilist, and so that is a form, I guess, of an aspect of determinism because a compatibilist holds that there's no contradiction between God willing something and a person freely, from his point of view, also willing it. So if I say, well, so we'll use Pharaoh. So if God wanted to harden Pharaoh's heart and Pharaoh and wanted Pharaoh to not let the Egyptian, not let the Hebrews go, I know my Bible, then Pharaoh, he would be able to cause Pharaoh not to want to let the Hebrews go, while also Pharaoh himself, of his own free will, there's different reasons of free will here, uh, not wanting to let them go as well. That's not a libertarian view. Again, it's a compatibilist view. So that answers your question, sort of. A type, I guess, of determinist in that regard, but of a compatibilist sense. Okay. Time travel. Yeah, that's a great question. It would have to exist, I think, in order for that to happen. Uh, I think you'd have to have some version. There's some versions of an A theory. I see someone going into that now all the time. That's going into the A and B theory. Uh, Well, no, you said atemporal. Or like a B theory, which says that things don't really change except that our experience of the world changes. And it's the idea that everything, Einstein, from what I understand, is kind of um, story, I guess it's true, tried to console a grieving widow, saying, "Your husband's not dead; he's just back in the past." Well, given that view of time, not very comforting. Um, all right, so old things pass away says, I like the distinction between us having a future and God being temporal. Yes, so we have a future in the sense that we are temporal beings, and so it is 9:55. So 10 o'clock is quote unquote in the future. Not that it really exists, but it just hasn't happened yet. But God isn't. God is an atemporal, eternal being in that sense. Is time travel possible? If you, it's theoretical. Physicists are playing with this idea. And being in the weird stuff I'm into, like ufology and UFOs, and some people think that this is people time traveling back to us. There are lots of assumptions here. You have to assume certain things with time and physics. Um, I don't think so from a philosophical point of view. I don't think time exists in these kind of ways. The physicists will look at it somewhat differently as a fourth dimension. I don't see it as that way. Um, and see, God is good, loving, and omnipresent, correct? A compatibilist. Yes, I'm a compatibilist. Again, that means that I think there's no contradiction in God saying, or in God willing somebody to will something else. So that God wills that I will something. And I do it, and I'm free because I'm the one willing it, right? So these are distinct ideas, he says, but God's not really distinct. Yes. But what makes our thoughts truth tracking about God if we know he's not the, oh, okay. Thomas don't think they're illusions, but I didn't see anything past there. Yeah, so when we say that God is loving, just, powerful, these kind of things, and I think that Holland does a great job in this book discussing this. So we say that God is simple, doesn't have parts, but we say he's just, powerful, loving, and knowledgeable. Aren't those distinct parts? No. They're different ways of describing the one being of God. And in him, they're all the same. But when we define them that way as concepts, we're picking out different aspects of how we're going to describe him because we know things through complex reality. We don't know things directly in the simple way that God is. So we have to describe God in improper ways, meaning they're not literally that way. We describe him the way that we have our experience. We're sensible beings, and we know things through our sensible experience of the world and through our composite and complex nature. Hope that helps. I don't know if that does or not. All right. Great questions. I appreciate it. This is why I like live streams. It's been fun. So I appreciate the comments and everything. Um, I'll hang out for a second. Any other questions or comments? I want to do more of these on the channel and have more videos. I want to be more consistent with stuff. So thanks for being here. I appreciate it. Um, if you like the stuff, check out the channel. If you want to subscribe to it, please do. You don't have to be a classical theist to subscribe to it. I welcome everyone to come and hang out with us in our community and have fun with us. And you can push back, you can ask questions, you can make objections, and I welcome that. I want to ask everyone to be, as you have been, very respectful, and I try to be respectful as well. So I hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to comment on the video. I'll keep writing back if I can. Email me, classicaltheology@gmail.com. This has been fun. I enjoyed it. We'll have more of these. Trying to see if there's anything else going to come in at the last second. Otherwise, what do you guys want to hear about? You're welcome. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. What kind of stuff would you guys like to have either recordings about, live streams about? Leave a comment here in the chat or in the recording after it's been posted. But thank you guys for being here. I appreciate it. It's been fun. It's been almost a whole hour. So if you've been here, you've been here for a long time doing theology, natural theology, and philosophy with us, as well as biblical theology as well. So appreciate it, guys. Thank you very much. We will see you next time. Take care.